In the vast expanse of the galactic community, where 1,000 different species trade, fight, and forge alliances among the stars, there exists an unspoken truth that echoes through every cantina, every diplomatic hall, and every military outpost. Humans are the galaxy's ultimate wild card. When Ambassador Zephyra of the proud Velthari Empire, a race so genetically superior they've never needed to interbreed with another species in their 10,000-year history, made what she thought was a simple statement about reproduction and racial purity, she had no idea she was about to encounter something that would shatter everything she believed about strength, survival, and what it truly means to be invincible. What happened next in that dimly lit space station bar didn't just change 2 lives, it rewrote the rules of an entire galaxy. Because sometimes, the most dangerous response isn't a weapon or a threat. Sometimes, it's just the truth, delivered by someone who's seen hell and walked back out carrying others on his shoulders. This is the story of how one human veteran's reply to an alien diplomat's casual cruelty became the spark that ignited a revolution across the stars. A revolution that would prove that humanity's greatest strength was never their technology, their weapons, or their tactics, but something far more terrifying to those who thought themselves superior. Their refusal to give up on anyone, even when the galaxy itself had given up on them. Hashtag the human veteran's reply. Part 1. The Nexus Station Cantina buzzed with the usual mix of alien voices, each species contributing to the cacophony that made the establishment famous across 3 sectors. Neon lights cast shifting colors across scales, fur, and chitinous shells as beings from dozens of worlds shared drinks and stories. The air recyclers worked overtime to accommodate the various atmospheric needs, creating a slightly metallic taste that most patrons had learned to ignore. Marcus Chun sat at the far end of the bar, his scarred hands wrapped around a glass of genuine earth whiskey, an expensive luxury this far from home. The amber liquid caught the light as he lifted it to his lips, taking a slow sip while his eyes tracked the movements around him. Old habits died hard, and after 15 years of military service, followed by another decade as a freelance security consultant, he couldn't turn off the part of his brain that cataloged exits, threats, and potential allies. At 43, Marcus carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had survived when survival seemed impossible. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray at the temples, and a network of thin scars traced patterns across his hands and forearms, souvenirs from conflicts across the galaxy. He wore a simple black jacket over dark pants, nothing that would mark him as military to a casual observer, but anyone who knew what to look for would recognize the way he positioned himself, the way his eyes never stopped moving, the careful economy of his movements. The conversation at the table behind him had been growing louder as the evening progressed. What had started as a diplomatic discussion between various alien species had devolved into something uglier as alcohol loosened tongues and revealed prejudices that polite society usually kept hidden. Marcus had been trying to ignore it, but the voices were becoming increasingly difficult to tune out. The genetic purity of our species has been maintained for over 10 millennia, came a melodious voice that somehow managed to sound both beautiful and condescending. We Velthari have never found it necessary to dilute our bloodlines with inferior genetic material. Marcus glanced over his shoulder and saw the speaker, a tall, elegant figure with pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer in the cantina's colored lighting. Ambassador Zephyra of the Velthari Empire was known throughout this sector, both for her diplomatic skills and her species' notorious superiority complex. The Velthari were undeniably impressive, long-lived, physically beautiful, naturally resistant to most diseases, and possessing a keen intelligence that had made them a major power in the galactic community. They were also, in Marcus's experience, insufferable. But surely, interrupted a gravelly voice belonging to a Korth trader, his stone-like features creased with what might have been amusement. Even your people must occasionally find attractions outside your species. Physical compatibility is one thing, but emotional bonds? Zephyra's laugh was like crystal chimes in a winter wind. Attraction? Perhaps. But such diversions are temporary at best. No one marries my race, you understand. Our genetic superiority makes such permanent unions both impossible and inadvisable. We might enjoy the company of lesser species for recreation, but When it comes to the continuation of our bloodline, we maintain our standards. She paused to sip from her glass, a pale green liquid that glowed faintly in the dim light. Of course, the reverse is not true. I could have children. My genetics are dominant enough to overwhelm most other species' contributions. But why would I want to weaken my offspring with inferior traits? Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard variations of this conversation before, in a dozen different cantinas across as many worlds. The galaxy was full of species that considered themselves superior to others, and the Velthari were among the worst offenders. But something about the casual cruelty in Zephyrah's tone, the way she dismissed entire races as inferior, struck a nerve he thought he'd learned to ignore. A young human woman at the next table had gone very still. Marcus could see her reflection in the bar's mirror. Seraph something or other, a junior diplomatic aide who couldn't be more than 25. Her face had gone pale, and her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. I noticed her earlier because she was one of only 3 humans in the cantina, and because she'd been sitting alone, nursing the same drink for over an hour while reading reports on a datapad. Inferior traits, repeated the Korth trader, his tone neutral but his small eyes glittering with something that might have been malicious amusement. And what traits might those be? Zephyrah gestured elegantly with one long-fingered hand. Short lifespans, genetic instability, emotional volatility, physical fragility. Take humans, for instance. They rarely live past a single century. Their genetics are a chaotic mess of conflicting traits, and they're so emotionally driven they make decisions based on feelings rather than logic. Useful as soldiers or laborers, perhaps, but hardly suitable for improving a superior bloodline. The young human woman's reflection showed her eyes closing briefly, her face flushing with what could have been anger or shame or both. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd gotten watching insurgents execute prisoners or seeing corrupt officials sell out their own people for profit. Their physical limitations alone, Zephyrah continued, warming to her subject, make them poor candidates for genetic mixing. Weak bones, vulnerable organs, susceptible to hundreds of diseases that other species shrug off. And their emotional instability. They bond inappropriately, make irrational sacrifices, engage in self-destructive behaviors for the sake of abstract concepts like honor or love. She laughed again, that beautiful cold sound. I've studied human psychology as part of my diplomatic training. They're fascinating in their dysfunction, really. They form attachments to beings they can't possibly hope to protect, make promises they can't keep, and throw away perfectly good lives for the sake of others who would never do the same for them. Marcus set down his glass with careful control. The whiskey suddenly tasted like ash in his mouth. He could see the young diplomat's hands shaking now, her knuckles white as she gripped her glass. Around the cantina, other patrons were beginning to notice the conversation, some nodding in agreement, others looking uncomfortable, but saying nothing. The humans have one trait that might be considered valuable, Zephyrah mused, as if considering a mildly interesting scientific specimen. Their reproductive adaptability. They can apparently interbreed with a remarkable variety of species, though why anyone would want to contaminate their genetics with human traits is beyond my understanding. The Korth trader chuckled, a sound like grinding stone. Perhaps their desperation makes them enthusiastic partners? Desperation. Zephyrah agreed with evident satisfaction. Yes, that captures it perfectly. They're so aware of their own inadequacies that they become quite eager to please. It's almost pitiful. Marcus felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders. He'd learned long ago that most fights weren't worth having, that sometimes the best thing you could do was walk away, finish your drink somewhere else, let other people's ignorance and cruelty remain their problem. He'd survived 15 years of military service by picking his battles carefully, and another decade of civilian life by remembering that lesson. But sometimes, Marcus reflected as he stood up from his bar stool, walking away wasn't an option. The young human woman looked up as his shadow fell across her table. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but there was something else there too, a stubborn determination not to let these aliens see her break. Marcus recognized that look. He'd seen it in mirrors after particularly brutal missions, in the faces of soldiers who'd lost friends but still had a job to do. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice pitched just loud enough for the Velthari ambassador to hear. Mind if I join you? Seems like there's an interesting discussion happening, and I'd hate to miss out. Sarah, he could see her name badge now, looked up at him with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. She nodded quickly, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Marcus pulled out the chair and sat down, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He could feel the attention of the cantina shifting toward him, conversations quieting as beings sensed the change in atmospheric pressure that often preceded violence. But Marcus's face remained calm, almost pleasant, as he turned slightly in his chair to address the Velthari ambassador. I couldn't help but overhear your fascinating insights into human genetics, he said, his tone conversational and mild. As a human myself, I'm always interested in outside perspectives on my species' limitations. Zephyra turned to face him fully, her large, dark eyes studying him with the kind of analytical interest a scientist might show when examining an unexpected lab result. Indeed, I hope I haven't given offense. I was merely sharing objective observations about the biological realities of interspecies relationships. No offense at all, Marcus assured her, settling back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man completely at peace with himself. I'm actually curious about something you said, about humans being too emotionally driven to make logical decisions, too physically weak to be useful partners, too short-lived and genetically unstable to contribute anything of value to a superior bloodline. Those are the facts, yes. Zephyra's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a slow child. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. I'm wondering if you've ever actually met any humans before tonight, or if your expertise comes purely from academic study. The ambassador's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been annoyance. I have had extensive contact with human diplomats and military personnel over the course of my career. I base my observations on direct experience as well as scientific data. Fascinating, Marcus said, and took a sip of his whiskey. Because I gotta tell you, Ambassador, your direct experience seems to have led you to some conclusions that don't match up with mine. The cantina had gone noticeably quieter now. Even species that had never seen a human before could sense the tension building between the two figures. Sarah was looking back and forth between them, her diplomatic training warring with what was clearly a desire to see where this conversation was heading. Oh, Zephyra's voice carried a note of polite interest that didn't quite hide her growing irritation. And what conclusions might those be? Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting hers with steady directness. Well, you mentioned that humans are too emotionally driven to make good decisions, that they form inappropriate attachments and make irrational sacrifices for abstract concepts. Correct, right? Marcus nodded. See, that's interesting because in my experience, those emotional attachments and irrational sacrifices are exactly what make humans dangerous. Something in his tone made Zephyra's elegant features sharpen with attention. Around the cantina, conversations had stopped entirely now. Even the usual background noise of the station seemed muted, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Dangerous? Zephyra repeated, her voice carrying a note of amused disbelief. Humans. To whom? Marcus smiled then, a quiet expression that somehow managed to be both gentle and absolutely terrifying. To anyone who thinks they can't be beaten, he said simply. He stood up from his chair, the movement flowing with the easy grace of someone completely comfortable with violence. You mentioned that humans throw away perfectly good lives for the sake of others who would never do the same for them. That they make promises they can't keep, form attachments to beings they can't protect. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out something small and metallic, setting it gently on the table where everyone could see it. It was a medal, tarnished with age, but still clearly recognizable as a military decoration. The insignia marked it as something awarded for extraordinary heroism under enemy fire. This belonged to a friend of mine, Marcus said quietly. Elena Vasquez. Human, like me. Small, like you pointed out, barely 5 feet tall, couldn't have weighed more than 50 kilos, soaking wet. Emotional, too. Always forming those inappropriate attachments you mentioned. He picked up the medal, turning it over in his scarred fingers. Elena was a combat medic. We were on Kepler 442b when the Zrekthal decided they wanted the planet for themselves. You know the Zrekthal, Ambassador? 8 feet tall, natural armor plating, strength that can punch through starship hull plating. They considered humans to be barely worth exterminating. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the ambient hum of the station's life support systems seemed to fade into the background. The Zrekthal had us outnumbered about 5-1. Marcus continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. Better weapons, better armor, better everything. They'd already overrun 3 human colonies, and they made sure we knew what they did to the civilians they captured. He set the metal back down on the table with infinite care. Elena's unit got cut off during the evacuation. 37 wounded soldiers, 17 civilians, and one emotionally unstable human medic who'd formed inappropriate attachments to all of them. Marcus looked up, meeting Zephyrah's eyes again. The logical thing would have been for Elena to abandon the wounded and escape with the civilians. Save who she could, minimize the losses. That's what a rational, superior being would have done, right? Zephyrah said nothing, but something in her expression had changed. Instead, Marcus said, Elena sent the civilians ahead with the soldiers who could still fight and stayed behind with the wounded. 47 beings who couldn't move fast enough to escape, who would have slowed down any rescue attempt, who were, by any logical calculation, already dead. He paused to take another sip of his whiskey, his hand perfectly steady. The Zrekthal found them 6 hours later. Elena had set up a defensive position in a bombed-out medical station, armed with nothing but a sidearm and whatever medical supplies she could scavenge. Marcus's voice remained calm, almost gentle, but something in his eyes made several of the cantina's patrons unconsciously lean away from their table. The rescue team found her 18 hours after that. She was still alive, still fighting, still protecting her patients. She'd killed 43 Zrekthal warriors with improvised explosives, stolen weapons, and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. He smiled again, that quiet, terrible expression. 43 warriors from a species that considered humans to be inferior insects. Elena saved 31 of her patients. She died 2 days later from wounds that should have killed her hours earlier, but she held on long enough to see every one of them evacuated to safety. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Marcus finished his whiskey and set the glass down with a soft clink that seemed to echo in the stillness. You asked what traits humans might bring to a superior bloodline, he said, standing up again and slipping the metal back into his jacket. Elena never had children. She was too busy forming inappropriate attachments to beings she couldn't possibly hope to protect. He looked around the cantina, taking in the faces of the various species, reading the mixture of discomfort, respect, and fear in their expressions. When his gaze returned to Zephyrah, she was sitting very still, her beautiful features unreadable. But if she had, Marcus continued, if she'd passed on those human traits you find so inferior, that emotional instability, that tendency to make irrational sacrifices, that stubborn refusal to abandon the beings they love, well, Ambassador, I think her children would have been absolutely terrifying. He nodded politely to Sarah, who was staring at him with something approaching awe. Enjoy your evening, everyone. Try to remember that the galaxy's full of different kinds of strength. Some of them just don't show up in your genetic databases. Marcus turned and walked toward the cantina's exit, his footsteps the only sound in the absolute silence that had fallen over the establishment. He was almost at the door when Zephyrah's voice stopped him. Human, she called out, her melodious tone carefully controlled. What was her name? The medic. Marcus paused without turning around. Elena Vasquez, he said quietly. She was 26 years old, loved terrible romantic comedies, and made the best coffee in 3 sectors. She also had the most beautiful laugh I ever heard. He did turn then, meeting the ambassador's eyes one final time. That's what you don't understand about humans, Ambassador. We don't fight because we're superior. We fight because we love something more than we fear losing. The door hissed shut behind him, leaving the cantina in stunned silence. It would be several minutes before anyone found the courage to resume their conversations, and when they did, the topics had changed considerably. Hashtag the Human Veterans Reply. Part 2 3 days later, Marcus was finishing his morning coffee in the small cafe near his temporary quarters when a shadow fell across his table. He looked up to see Ambassador Zephyrah standing beside his booth, her elegant form somehow managing to look both regal and uncertain. She wore different clothes than she had in the cantina, a flowing outfit in deep blue that complemented her pale skin, but her large dark eyes held the same analytical intensity he remembered. "Mr. Chun," she said, her melodious voice carefully neutral. "May I join you?" Marcus gestured to the seat across from him, setting down his coffee cup with the same deliberate care he brought to most actions. "Ambassador, I'm surprised to see you in this part of the station." Zephyros slid into the booth with fluid grace, folding her long fingers together on the table surface. "I want to speak with you about our conversation the other evening. I realize I may have misjudged certain aspects of human nature." "May have." Marcus raised an eyebrow, taking another sip of his coffee. "That's refreshingly diplomatic of you." She had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I've been researching Elena Vasquez since our encounter. The official records of the Kepler 442b incident are illuminating." Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of the condescension that had marked their previous interaction. He found none, which was interesting in itself. "And what did those records tell you?" "That you understated her actions considerably." Zephyros' voice carried a note of something that might have been respect. "The Zrekthal commander she killed was their war chief, a veteran of 17 campaigns who had never been defeated in personal combat. She killed him with a scalpel and a half-empty medical injector." "Elena was resourceful," Marcus agreed mildly. Zephyra leaned forward slightly, her expression intense. "She held her position for 18 hours against odds that should have been mathematically impossible. The tactical analysis suggests she shouldn't have lasted 18 minutes. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic of his coffee mug. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. "Elena always said that math was just another enemy trying to tell her what she couldn't do. I spoke with my military attaché about human combat performance," Zephyra continued. "The data is confusing. Human soldiers should be among the weakest in the galaxy by every objective measure, yet their combat effectiveness ratings consistently exceed theoretical projections." "Confusing how?" Zephyra pulled out a datapad and activated a holographic display between them. Charts and graphs flickered into existence, showing comparative species data across multiple categories. Physical strength, reaction time, natural armor, toxin resistance. Humans rank in the bottom quartile for every measurable combat attribute. Yet their actual battlefield performance. She gestured to another set of data, and Marcus saw win-loss ratios, casualty statistics, and mission success rates that told a very different story. These numbers suggest that humans routinely achieve victory against forces that should have destroyed them completely. Zephyra's tone held genuine puzzlement. "My analyst can't explain the discrepancy." Marcus glanced at the data, recognizing some of the battle names from his own service record. "What do your analysts think accounts for the difference?" "Equipment advantages, superior tactics, battlefield luck." She paused, studying his face. "But those factors don't fully explain the statistical anomalies. There's something else at work, something that doesn't show up in our models." "And what do you think it is?" Zephyra was quiet for several seconds, her dark eyes distant. "I think," she said finally, "that we've been measuring the wrong things." Marcus finished his coffee and set the mug aside. "Tell me more about your research into human psychology. You mentioned diplomatic training." "Standard xenopsychology coursework," Zephyra replied, dismissing the data display with a gesture. "Emotional triggers, decision-making patterns, cultural values. The curriculum focuses on predicting and influencing human behavior in diplomatic contexts." "And what does that training tell you about human motivations?" "That humans are driven primarily by emotional impulses rather than logical analysis. They prioritize personal relationships over abstract benefits, make decisions based on sentiment rather than optimal outcomes." She paused. "The training suggests this makes them relatively easy to manipulate, since emotional beings are predictable in their irrationality." Marcus smiled grimly. "Let me guess, your diplomatic success rate with human negotiators hasn't matched those predictions." Zephyra's expression shifted, revealing the first crack in her composure. "Actually, no. Human diplomats have proven surprisingly difficult to influence through conventional means." "Difficult how?" "They seem to operate from a different framework entirely. Where other species respond to logical incentives, trade advantages, territorial concessions, technological exchanges, humans often reject objectively beneficial arrangements for reasons our analysts can't quantify. Marcus leaned back in his booth, studying the ambassador's face. Give me an example. Last year, we offered the human colony on New Geneva a defensive alliance. In exchange for basing rights for our fleet, we would provide complete protection from hegemony raids. The economic and security benefits were overwhelming. There was literally no logical reason for them to refuse. But they did. They did. Frustration crept into Zephyrah's voice. Their representative said they appreciated our offer, but they preferred to stand on their own feet. Even when we explained that the hegemony had already destroyed 3 colonies in that sector, they maintained their position. And New Geneva repelled 2 separate hegemony attacks using improvised defenses and civilian volunteers. They shouldn't have survived the first engagement, but somehow. She trailed off, shaking her head. Somehow they did. Somehow they did. Zephyr met his eyes. Just like Elena Vasquez shouldn't have held her position for 18 hours, but somehow she did. Just like humans shouldn't win battles against superior forces, but somehow they do. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering how much of the truth he wanted to share with her. You know what I think your problem is, Ambassador? I'm beginning to suspect it's more fundamental than I initially believed. You're trying to understand humans by studying what we think, instead of studying what we choose. Zephyrah's brow furrowed in concentration. Explain. Marcus signaled the waitress for another coffee, organizing his thoughts. Every species in a galaxy makes decisions based on some kind of calculation. Risk versus reward, cost versus benefit, personal advantage versus loss. You study those calculations because they're logical, predictable, quantifiable. Of course, how else would one analyze decision-making patterns? But humans don't make decisions based on calculations, Marcus said quietly. We make decisions based on commitments. The waitress, a pleasant Kepler native with blue-tinted skin and for arms, refilled Marcus's mug and offered one to Zephyrah, who declined with a polite gesture. Commitments. Zup, ira, repa. Elena didn't stay behind because she calculated that she could defeat 43 Zrekthul warriors. She stayed because she'd committed to protecting her patients, and breaking that commitment was literally unthinkable to her. Marcus took a careful sip of the hot coffee. The colonists on New Geneva didn't refuse your alliance because they calculated they could defend themselves better than your fleet. They refused because they'd committed to independence, and accepting your protection would have broken that commitment. But that's... Zephyrah struggled with the concept. That's completely irrational. Commitments that lead to objectively negative outcomes should be abandoned. Should they? Marcus met her eyes. By whose definition? Zephyrah opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly working through the implications. Let me ask you something, Marcus continued. How many Velthari would be willing to die to protect a wounded stranger? That would depend entirely on the circumstances. The value of the individual, the likelihood of success, the resources required. How many would die to protect a wounded stranger they'd never met before, with no possibility of reward or recognition, against overwhelming odds? Zephyrah was quiet for a long moment. Very few, she admitted finally. Such sacrifice would serve no logical purpose. And how many humans would? She considered the question seriously, her analytical mind working through everything she'd learned about human behavior. Based on the data I've reviewed, many of them, far more than statistical models would predict. Right? Marcus nodded. And that's why your analysts can't explain our battlefield performance. They're trying to predict what humans will do based on logical self-interest, but humans don't operate from self-interest. We operate from something much more dangerous, which is... Marcus was quiet for several heartbeats, staring out the cafe's viewport at the stars beyond. The absolute conviction that some things are more important than staying alive. Zephyrah absorbed this in silence, her quick mind working through the ramifications. That's terrifying, she said finally. Yes, it is. Marcus's voice was gentle but implacable, and it's why humans are never as weak as they appear to be. Because when you're fighting someone who cares more about victory than survival, the usual calculations stop working. But surely there must be limits. Humans have families, personal goals, things they value more than abstract principles. Marcus smiled sadly. You'd think so, wouldn't you? But here's the thing about human commitments. They're not abstract to us. Elena didn't see abstract principles when she looked at her wounded patients. She saw people who were counting on her, people who would die if she failed them. That commitment was as real and concrete to her as her own heartbeat. He pulled out his datapad and showed her a photograph. A young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, wearing military fatigues and standing next to a field medical station. Elena left behind a brother who needed her help paying for his education, a mother who worried about her every day, and a fiancé who wanted to marry her when her tour was up. Zephyros studied the photograph with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle. But she chose to protect strangers instead of returning to them. She didn't choose one over the other, Marcus corrected gently. She chose to be the kind of person who could live with herself. For Elena, abandoning her patients would have meant becoming someone her family wouldn't recognize, someone she couldn't bear to be, even if they would have forgiven her. Especially if they would have forgiven her. Marcus put the datapad away, because then she'd have to carry that forgiveness for the rest of her life, knowing she didn't deserve it. Zephyros stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through confusion, realization, and something approaching awe. You're saying that humans make decisions based on maintaining consistency with some internal identity, rather than optimizing external outcomes. That's a very clinical way to put it, but yes. And this internal identity is shaped by commitments rather than logical analysis. Right again, Zephyra leaned back in her seat, her mind clearly racing. This explains so many anomalies in our diplomatic relations. Humans who refuse beneficial treaties because they contradict previous agreements. Negotiators who walk away from advantageous deals because they involve betraying allies. It also explains why humans are so difficult to conquer, Marcus added quietly. Because conquest isn't just a military defeat, it's an existential challenge to everything we've committed ourselves to being. But this system is incredibly inefficient, Zephyra protested. Humans must suffer enormous losses pursuing suboptimal strategies. Marcus considered this, turning his coffee mug in his hands. We do. But we also achieve victories that should be impossible, survive disasters that should be extinctions, and build alliances that last for centuries because everyone knows we'll honor our commitments even when it hurts us. The inefficiency is also a source of strength. Exactly. When every other species in the galaxy makes decisions based on calculation, being the ones who make decisions based on principle becomes a strategic advantage. Zephyra was quiet for several minutes, processing everything he'd told her. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. I think I'm beginning to understand why my people find humans so unsettling. Oh, we pride ourselves on our rationality, our ability to make optimal decisions based on complete information. But humans routinely achieve outcomes that our optimal strategies can't match, using methods that shouldn't work. Marcus finished his second cup of coffee. It's like playing a game where your opponent doesn't follow the rules, except they're not cheating, they're just playing a completely different game. And winning? Sometimes. We also lose spectacularly when our commitments conflict with reality. Marcus's expression grew somber. The galaxy's full of dead human heroes who chose principle over survival. But the ones who survive tend to reshape the galaxy around them. Marcus stood up, leaving payment for his coffee on the table. Your people have been dominant for 10,000 years because you're superior in almost every measurable way. But humans have been spreading across the galaxy for less than 2 centuries, and we're already changing how everyone else thinks about warfare, diplomacy, and alliance building. Zephyra stood as well, her tall frame graceful despite her obvious distraction. Where does this lead, Mr. Chun? If humans continue to expand their influence using these methods? Marcus paused at the cafe's entrance, considering the question seriously. I honestly don't know, Ambassador. But I can tell you this. We're not going to stop being human just because it makes other species uncomfortable. And what does being human mean exactly? Marcus smiled, and for the first time since they'd met, the expression was entirely warm and genuine. It means we're going to keep forming inappropriate attachments to beings we can't possibly hope to protect, making irrational sacrifices for abstract principles, and refusing to abandon anyone we've promised to defend. He paused, meeting her eyes one final time. Even when the galaxy tells us we're too weak to matter. The cafe door hissed shut behind him, leaving Zephyra alone with her thoughts and the growing realization that everything her people believed about strength and superiority might need to be reconsidered. Hashtag the Human Veterans Reply. Part 3. 2 weeks after his second conversation with Ambassador Zephyra, Marcus was deep in sleep when emergency klaxons began wailing throughout Nexus Station. Years of military training had him awake and reaching for his clothes before his conscious mind had fully processed the sound. The familiar weight of adrenaline settled into his bloodstream as he dressed quickly, checking his personal communicator for updates. The message that appeared made him pause mid-motion. Station-wide emergency. Hegemony raiding fleet detected approaching system. All civilian vessels prepare for immediate evacuation. Military personnel report to assigned stations. Marcus wasn't military personnel anymore, but old habits ran deeper than official designations. He finished dressing, strapped on the sidearm he wasn't officially supposed to carry, and headed for the station's command center. If the hegemony was coming, there would be wounded men in need for people who knew how to function under pressure. The corridors were already filled with beings from dozens of species, all moving with the controlled urgency that marked the difference between evacuation and panic. Marcus noticed that most were heading toward the civilian departure bays, but a significant number were moving in the same direction. He was toward the heart of the station where decisions would be made and stands would be taken. The command center was a controlled chaos of activity when Marcus arrived. Banks of monitors showed tactical displays. Communication arrays crackled with reports from patrol ships, and officers from multiple species coordinated what appeared to be a fighting retreat. At the center of it all stood Station Commander Thaxol, a veteran Korth whose stone-like features had seen conflicts across 3 sectors. "Chun!" The commander's gravelly voice cut through the noise as he spotted Marcus near the entrance. "What's your status? Are you available for emergency consultation?" Marcus moved toward the central tactical display, reading the situation from the arrangement of icons and vectors. "Available, Commander. What's the tactical picture?" Thaxol gestured to the holographic representation of the system with one massive hand. Hegemony Battle Group entered the outer system 6 hours ago. 12 heavy cruisers, at least 30 escort vessels, and what our scouts are calling a harvester ship. Marcus studied the display, noting the formation patterns and approach vectors. The hegemony were raiders on a massive scale, a coalition of species that had decided cooperation was less profitable than conquest. They specialized in fast strikes against lightly defended targets, taking whatever they wanted and destroying what they couldn't carry. Population of Nexus Station? Marcus asked. 87,000 beings across 43 species, replied the station's intelligence officer, a tall Velthari whom Marcus recognized as one of Zephyra's attaches. Current defensive capability consists of 4 patrol corvettes and fixed-station weapons designed for anti-piracy operations. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. Nexus Station was a civilian facility designed for trade and diplomacy rather than warfare. Against a hegemony battle group, it might last long enough for some of the civilians to escape, if they were very lucky. Evacuation progress. Marcus continued. 70% of civilian vessels have departed or are in departure queues, Thaxol reported. Remaining population consists primarily of station personnel and beings without access to private transport. Marcus did the mental arithmetic and didn't like the results. That leaves about 26,000 beings who can't evacuate before the raiders arrive. Correct. The commander's tone held the grim resignation of someone who'd seen this scenario play out before. Our best projections give us 18 hours before the hegemony fleet reaches effective weapons range. What's the closest military response? The intelligence officer consulted his displays. Velthari Patrol Fleet is 36 hours out. Human Defense Force Squadron is 42 hours out. Korth Battle Group is... He paused, recalculating. 61 hours. So we're on our own. Marcus absorbed this information with the calm that came from experience with desperate situations. What's the plan, Commander? Thaxol's massive shoulders moved in what might have been a shrug. Hold as long as possible. Evacuate who we can, minimize casualties. Standard procedure for this type of scenario. Marcus studied the tactical display again, noting details that military experience had taught him to look for. Commander, may I ask what species are represented in the population that can evacuate? The intelligence officer pulled up demographic data. Mixed composition. Significant populations of Velthari diplomatic personnel, Korth traders, a small human delegation, various minor species without significant military capability. And the hegemony's known behavior patterns with civilian populations? The command center grew noticeably quieter at this question. Everyone present knew the answer, but saying it out loud made it real in a way that tactical abstractions didn't. The hegemony doesn't take prisoners, Thaxel said finally. They strip systems of anything valuable, destroy infrastructure to prevent recovery, and eliminate potential threats. Which means everyone on this station who can evacuate in the next 18 hours is going to die. The commander concluded with brutal honesty. Marcus was quiet for several seconds, his mind working through possibilities and probabilities. When he spoke again, his voice carried an odd note of speculation. Commander, what if I told you I had an idea that might change those odds? Thaxel's small eyes focused on him with sudden intensity. I'd ask you to explain it quickly. First, I need to know, are there any humans on this station besides myself and the diplomatic delegation? The intelligence officer consulted his databases again. 12 humans currently aboard. 2 diplomatic staff, 3 independent traders for civilian contractors, 2 station technical personnel, and yourself. 12. Marcus nodded slowly. And how many of those would you estimate have military or security backgrounds? Why does that matter? Asked a new voice. Marcus turned to see Ambassador Zephyra entering the command center, her elegant form moving with purpose despite the chaos around them. Because, Ambassador, Marcus replied, I think it's time you learned what happens when humans stop calculating odds and start making commitments. Zephyra moved to stand beside him at the tactical display. Her dark eyes studying the overwhelming enemy force shown in the hologram. You have a plan? I have an idea, Marcus corrected. Whether it's a plan depends on whether 12 humans can convince 26,000 beings to do something that should be impossible. Commander Thaxel leaned forward, his massive frame casting shadows across the display. Explain. Marcus gestured to the tactical representation of Nexus Station, a complex structure of interconnected modules and defensive platforms. Standard evacuation doctrine says we hold the station as long as possible while civilians escape, then either surrender or die fighting when the enemy arrives. Correct. But what if we don't evacuate the civilians at all? The command center erupted in voices, protests, questions, accusations of madness. Marcus waited for the noise to subside before continuing. Every military manual in the galaxy says that defending a fixed installation against superior mobile forces is suicide, he said calmly. The enemy has tactical flexibility, numerical advantage, and the ability to concentrate firepower at will. Defenders are trapped, outnumbered, and inevitably overwhelmed. All of which is accurate, Thaxel pointed out grimly. Unless, Marcus continued, the defenders refuse to be trapped. Zephyra was studying his face with growing understanding. You want to turn the entire station into a mobile fortress? Not exactly. Marcus manipulated the tactical display, highlighting different sections of the station structure. Nexus Station was built modularly for expansion and maintenance. Most sections can be detached and operated independently if necessary. Emergency protocols, the intelligence officer confirmed. In case of catastrophic system failure or environmental disaster. Marcus nodded. Right. So instead of defending one large target that can't maneuver, we turn ourselves into 50 smaller targets that can. The command center was quiet as the implication sank in. Commander Thaxel was the first to speak. The logistics would be nightmarish. Most station modules don't have independent life support for extended periods, and civilian populations aren't trained for combat operations. True, Marcus agreed, but they also don't have to be. The modules don't need to fight the enemy fleet. They just need to survive long enough for help to arrive. 36 hours for the Velthari, the intelligence officer murmured, following the logic. If the station modules could evade destruction for that long, The hegemony specializes in overwhelming single targets with concentrated firepower, Marcus explained. But their tactics break down when they're facing dozens of independent units moving in unpredictable patterns. They'd have to spread their forces to engage multiple targets, which gives each module better odds of survival. Zephyra was manipulating her own datapad, running calculations. The mathematics are interesting. Individual modules would have much lower defensive capabilities, but the enemy's ability to apply concentrated force would be similarly reduced. It's not about the mathematics, Marcus said quietly. It's about psychology. Explain. Marcus turned to face the assembled officers, his expression serious. The hegemony expects their victims to behave rationally, to surrender when resistance becomes futile, to prioritize survival over principle, to make decisions based on cost-benefit analysis. He gestured to the tactical display. But what happens when they encounter an enemy that doesn't make rational decisions? When they attack a target that should surrender, but instead breaks into 50 pieces and keeps fighting? You're talking about psychological warfare, Thaxel realized. Disrupting their decision-making process by behaving in ways their tactical doctrine doesn't account for. Exactly. Marcus smiled grimly. Humans have been winning impossible battles for centuries by refusing to follow the rules that everyone else takes for granted. We're not stronger or smarter or better equipped. We just commit to outcomes that our enemies think are unachievable. Zephyra looked up from her calculations. This plan would require perfect coordination between dozens of independent units, with no central command structure and limited communication capabilities. Yes, the civilian populations would have to accept significant personal risk for the sake of collective survival. Yes, many of the modules would likely be destroyed despite evasive maneuvers. Probably. Zephyra studied his face intently. And you believe the station's population will agree to this? Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking about Elena Vasquez and her impossible stand about the colonists of New Geneva who chose independence over safety, about 1,000 other examples of humans choosing principle over survival. I think, he said finally, that if we explain the situation honestly and give people a choice between certain death and probable death with a chance to save everyone, most beings will surprise you with their courage. Commander Thaxel examined the tactical display with new eyes, his military experience warring with conventional wisdom. The plan has merit, he admitted grudgingly, but the coordination required would be enormous. We need experienced leaders for each module, clear communication protocols, predetermined evasion patterns. We need people who can make decisions under pressure and inspire others to follow them into danger, Marcus agreed. People who understand that sometimes the only way to win is to commit to something that looks like losing. Humans, Zephyros said softly. Humans, Marcus confirmed. 12 of us to lead 50 modules filled with 26,000 beings who are about to learn what it means to refuse to give up. The command center was silent except for the continuing chatter from communication arrays and the distant sound of evacuation procedures. Marcus could see the moment when the room's collective mindset shifted from resignation to possibility, from preparing to die to preparing to fight. We'll need to move fast, Thaxel said finally. 18 hours to reorganize the entire station, train civilian crews, establish communication networks. We'll need volunteers, added the intelligence officer. People willing to take responsibility for modules they've never operated, leading beings they've never met. We'll need to convince 26,000 individuals to trust their lives to a plan that defies every tactical manual ever written, Zephyra concluded. Marcus looked around the command center, meeting the eyes of officers and staff members who were already beginning to understand what they were committing themselves to. Then, we better get started, he said simply. The next 18 hours would test every assumption the galaxy had about human nature, about rational decision-making, and about what was possible when beings refused to accept the limitations that mathematics placed on their survival. But first, Marcus needed to find 12 humans and convince them to do something that should have been impossible. Turn a diplomatic station into a weapon that could defeat an enemy fleet without firing a shot. Hashtag the human veterans reply. Part 4 14 hours before the hegemony fleet would arrive at Nexus Station, Marcus stood in the main assembly bay facing a crowd of 26,000 beings from across the galaxy. The massive space, normally used for trade exhibitions and diplomatic ceremonies, now hummed with nervous energy as species who had never imagined fighting for their lives tried to understand what they were being asked to do. The 12 humans were scattered throughout the crowd, not by design, but because that's where they'd ended up when word spread through the station that someone needed volunteers for something impossible. Marcus could see them. Sarah Chun, the young diplomat whose dignity had started this entire chain of events. Tom Rodriguez, a cargo hauler whose ship was too slow to escape the approaching fleet. Dr. Amanda Foster, a xenobiologist who'd missed the last evacuation transport because she'd been helping evacuate injured civilians. 11 others, each with their own reasons for staying, each about to discover what it meant to be human in a galaxy that had written them off as inferior. "I'm not going to lie to you," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the bay's audio system. "What we're proposing shouldn't work. By every logical analysis, most of you are going to die in the next 36 hours. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. Several beings near the exits began moving toward them, choosing the certain death of staying behind over the probable death of fighting. Marcus waited for them to leave. He'd learned long ago that volunteers who had to be talked into heroism rarely proved reliable when the situation became desperate. "The hegemony fleet outguns us by a factor of approximately 50 to 1, he continued when the movement stopped. "They have more ships, better weapons, and tactical mobility that our fixed station can't match. In conventional terms, we're already dead." Ambassador Zephyra stood near the front of the crowd, her elegant features composed but her dark eyes intense with concentration. Around her, Marcus could see Velthari diplomats and staff members listening with the careful attention of beings trying to understand an alien form of logic. But here's what the hegemony doesn't know about the beings they're planning to kill, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "They don't know that Korth engineer Thralvan has spent the last 6 hours modifying atmospheric recyclers to provide independent life support for 47 station modules. They don't know that Velthari technician SYPH Era has figured out how to slave navigation controls to personal data pads. They don't know that humans aren't the only species in this galaxy that refuses to give up when giving up makes sense." Tom Rodriguez stepped forward from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, his weathered face split by a grin that belonged on someone who hadn't been sentenced to death. "What do you need us to do, Marcus?" "We're going to break Nexus Station into 50 independent units," Marcus replied, his words carrying to every corner of the vast bay. "Each module will have its own life support, basic propulsion, and approximately 500 beings. When the hegemony arrives, instead of finding one large target to destroy, they're going to find 50 smaller ones moving in completely unpredictable patterns." A Velthari voice called out from the crowd. "How can civilian modules possibly evade military vessels?" "They can't," Marcus answered honestly. "But they don't have to outrun the enemy's ships. They just have to avoid being in the same place when the weapons fire arrives. And unlike military vessels, civilian modules can make course changes that don't make tactical sense." Sarah Chun had moved to where Marcus could see her clearly, her young face showing the same stubborn determination he'd seen in the cantina. "You want us to fly like we're crazy," she said, understanding immediately. "I want you to fly like you're human," Marcus corrected. "Like beings who make decisions based on commitment rather than calculation. Like people who will do whatever it takes to protect the beings counting on them." Dr. Foster's voice cut through the murmur of conversation that followed. "What about weapons? These modules weren't designed for combat." "We don't need weapons," Marcus replied. "Our goal isn't to destroy the enemy fleet. It's to survive until help arrives. The Velthari patrol force will be here in 36 hours. If we can stay alive that long, we win." Commander Thaxol stepped forward, his massive Korth frame imposing even among the crowd. "Each module will be assigned a human coordinator," he announced, his gravelly voice carrying absolute authority. "These coordinators will have complete operational control during the engagement. Their decisions are final, regardless of conventional wisdom or species-specific tactical doctrine." The implications of this statement rippled through the crowd. Beings from species that had conquered star systems were being asked to place their lives in the hands of humans. The species they've been taught to consider emotionally unstable and tactically unreliable. Marcus could see the moment when the choice crystallized for each being in the bay. stay and fight under human leadership with a tiny chance of survival, or accept certain death with dignity intact. One by one, beings began stepping forward. The first was unexpected, an elderly Zrekthal trader whose natural armor plating showed the scars of a dozen conflicts. Marcus recognized the species immediately. They were the ones who had nearly killed Elena Vasquez and her patients. But this individual moved with deliberate purpose toward the front of the crowd. Human, the Zrekthal said in heavily accented standard, his voice carrying the grinding undertones of his species. I am Kethmore. I have fought hegemony raiders before. They killed my family on their Ion Prime. I will follow you. More beings began moving forward. Velthari diplomats who should have been evacuating to safety, Korth engineers whose practical nature rebelled against accepting defeat, representatives from a dozen minor species who had learned that sometimes the only choice was between fighting and dying. Within minutes, the entire crowd had sorted itself into those moving toward the front and those heading for the exits. Marcus was surprised by the ratio. Almost 90% had chosen to stay and fight. Module assignments are being distributed now. Thaxel announced as station personnel began handing out datapads throughout the crowd. Each module has been equipped with basic life support, emergency propulsion, and communication equipment. Module coordinators will have final authority over all tactical decisions. Marcus watched as the 12 humans spread throughout the crowd, each taking responsibility for multiple modules and the hundreds of beings who would depend on their judgment. He caught Tom Rodriguez's eye across the bay and saw the same grim determination that had kept Elena Vasquez fighting for 18 hours against impossible odds. One more thing, Marcus called out as beings began organizing into their assigned groups. The hegemony is going to offer you surrender terms. They always do. It's part of their tactical doctrine. They'll promise to spare civilian lives in exchange for station resources and strategic information. The bay grew quiet, every being focused on his words. Those promises are lies, Marcus continued bluntly. The hegemony doesn't take prisoners, doesn't honor agreements with what they consider inferior species, and doesn't leave survivors who might testify to their crimes. When they offer you terms, remember that they've already decided you're going to die. The only question is whether you die fighting or die on your knees. Zephyros stepped forward, her melodious voice carrying clearly through the bay. And if we choose to die fighting, what does that accomplish? Marcus smiled then, the same quiet expression that had unnerved her in the cantina weeks earlier. It teaches the galaxy something important, Ambassador. It teaches them that some beings refuse to be conquered, no matter what the odds. It teaches them that strength isn't just about superior genetics or advanced technology. He paused, looking around the bay at the thousands of faces from dozens of species, all united by the simple decision to refuse defeat. And maybe, he continued softly, it teaches our children that their parents were the kind of beings worth being proud of. The next 4 hours were controlled chaos as Nexus Station transformed itself from a diplomatic facility into something the galaxy had never seen before. Modules detached from the main structure with mechanical precision, their improvised crews learning to operate systems they'd never trained for. Communication networks established backup protocols for coordinating 50 independent units. Emergency supplies were distributed based on module capacity and crew requirements. Marcus found himself assigned to Module 7, along with 230 beings from 11 different species. His crew included Velthari technicians, Korth engineers, human traders, and representatives from 6 minor species whose names he was still learning to pronounce. Status report, he said as the module completed its separation sequence and drifted free of the main station structure. Life support stable for 48 hours, reported Chief Engineer Thralvin, the Korth whose improvised atmospheric systems were keeping them all alive. Propulsion systems responding normally. Communication links with other modules operational. Navigation, Marcus asked. Completely manual, replied Dr. Foster from her position at the improvised helm. No automated systems, no predictive guidance, no tactical computers. Just reaction thrusters and human intuition. Marcus nodded approvingly. Military vessels relied on sophisticated computer systems to calculate optimal courses and predict enemy movement. Those same systems made their behavior predictable to enemy tacticians. But a module guided by human intuition and random decision-making would be nearly impossible to anticipate. Time to enemy contact? 9 hours, 37 minutes, came the answer from multiple voices simultaneously. Marcus activated the module's communication system, opening a channel to the 49 other units scattered around the system. All modules, this is Coordination 7. Final equipment check, and crew briefing in 30 minutes. Remember, our job isn't to be heroes. Our job is to survive long enough for the cavalry to arrive. Tom Rodriguez's voice crackled back over the communications array. Coordination 12 acknowledging. My grandmother used to say that the best revenge on people who want you dead is refusing to die. Let's make her proud. Sarah Chin's module reported next. Coordination 3 ready. We got 68 Velthari civilians who've never been in combat, but they're learning fast. Turns out diplomats are really good at coordinating under pressure. One by one, the other modules checked in. Marcus listened to the voices of 11 other humans, each responsible for hundreds of beings who had chosen probable death over certain defeat. He thought about Elena Vasquez, who would have understood exactly why they were doing this. All modules, he said finally, this is your final reminder that we're not trying to win a conventional battle. We're trying to prove that some things are more important than tactical superiority. If we can do that for 36 hours, we'll have accomplished something no military manual thought was possible. The communication channel was quiet for a moment before Tom's voice came back, carrying a note of grim humor. Marcus, you realize we're about to demonstrate that humans really are as crazy as the rest of the galaxy thinks we are. Yeah, Marcus replied, looking around his module at the faces of beings who had committed their lives to an impossible plan. But we're also about to prove that crazy and weak aren't the same thing. Outside the module's viewport, the stars wheeled slowly as emergency thrusters adjusted their course. Somewhere in that vast darkness, a hegemony battle fleet was approaching with a confident expectation of finding easy prey. They were about to discover what happened when their prey refused to behave like victims. Hashtag the human veterans reply. Part 5 The hegemony fleet dropped out of hyperspace exactly on schedule, their massive vessels materializing against the star field like mechanical harbingers of death. Marcus watched from Module 7's main viewport as 12 heavy cruisers and their escort flotilla spread into attack formation, their weapons systems already charging for what should have been a simple target elimination. Contact, reported Dr. Foster from the navigation station. Enemy fleet is broadcasting standard surrender demands on all frequencies. Marcus activated the module's communication array, listening to the familiar arrogance that marked hegemony operations. Unidentified station. This is War Commander HFY of the hegemony Fleet Crimson Talon. You are ordered to surrender all defensive systems and prepare for occupation. Compliance will result in preservation of civilian personnel. Resistance will result in total elimination. The message repeated in 17 different languages, each translation carrying the same combination of threat and false promise. Marcus had heard similar ultimatums on a dozen different worlds, and he'd seen what happened to civilians who believed them. All modules, he broadcast on the coordination frequency. Enemy contact confirmed. Execute dispersal pattern alpha and maintain communication discipline. Remember, we're not fighting them, we're surviving them. Through his viewport, Marcus could see the other modules beginning to scatter. What had been a loose cluster of connected station sections was rapidly becoming a cloud of independent units, each following its own trajectory based on the unpredictable decisions of its human coordinator. The hegemony fleet's response was immediate and predictable. Energy lances stabbed out from their heavy weapons, targeting what appeared to be the largest concentration of modules. The beams struck empty space where their targeting computers had calculated the station's main structure should have been. Pattern recognition, Marcus murmured, watching the enemy fleet's confusion play out across tactical displays. They're trying to identify our command structure, predict our movement patterns, establish targeting priorities. And finding nothing that makes sense, Dr. Foster added, her hands dancing across manual controls as she threw their module into a spiral that no sane pilot would attempt. Their computers are designed for conventional warfare, not whatever this is. Module 12, under Tom Rodriguez's command, suddenly accelerated directly toward the enemy fleet before spinning end over end and diving below the plane of battle. Module 3, guided by Sarah Chin's diplomatic intuition, began a series of seemingly random course changes that somehow managed to avoid 3 separate weapons barges. Coordination 7 to all modules. Marcus broadcast. Enemy is attempting to establish firing solutions based on predictive algorithms. Continue random maneuvering. Do not, repeat, do not, attempt to follow tactical doctrine. The next 30 minutes became a deadly game of 3-dimensional cat and mouse, with 50 modules scattered across thousands of cubic kilometers of space while the hegemony fleet tried to engage targets that refused to behave rationally. Every time the enemy concentrated fire on a cluster of modules, the cluster dissolved into individual units, moving in completely different directions. "This is insane," muttered Chief Engineer Thrall Vin, his stone-like features showing the strain of watching civilian modules perform maneuvers that should have torn them apart. "Those acceleration forces should be killing everyone aboard." "Inertial dampeners are holding," Dr. Foster reported, sweat beading on her forehead as she pushed their improvised systems beyond their design specifications. "But we can't maintain this intensity forever." Marcus checked his chronometer. 27 hours until the Veltheri patrol fleet arrived. They'd been evading the hegemony for less than an hour, and already the stress was beginning to show on both equipment and crew. The enemy's next move was predictable and brutal. Unable to establish targeting solutions on individual modules, they began saturating entire sectors of space with weapons fire. Energy beams and explosive projectiles filled the darkness, turning vast volumes of vacuum into killing zones. Module 19, coordinated by a human mining engineer named Peterson, simply vanished in a flash of coherent energy. 312 beings, including Peterson himself, disappeared in an instant when their evasive maneuver took them directly into a weapons barrage meant for a different target. "Module 19 is gone," came Tom's voice over the communication array, his tone carefully controlled. "No survivors." Marcus felt the familiar weight of loss settle into his chest, the same feeling he'd carried after watching Elena's medical station disappear under Zrekthal artillery fire. But grief was a luxury they couldn't afford while 49 modules still depended on their coordination. Acknowledged Module 12. Continue evasive patterns. Remember, we honor them by surviving. The hegemony's war commander was growing frustrated, Marcus realized. The aliens' tactical broadcasts were becoming shorter and more aggressive, his fleet's movements increasingly desperate as they tried to engage an enemy that simply wouldn't stand still long enough to be destroyed efficiently. Coordination 7, came Sarah's voice from Module 3. "I'm reading energy signatures from the enemy fleet's harvester ship. They're preparing to deploy something." Marcus switched his display to long-range sensors, studying the massive vessel that served as the fleet's mobile base. The harvester was nearly 10 times the size of the largest cruiser, designed to strip entire planets of useful resources while the battle fleet eliminated resistance. Deployment pods, he realized, watching dozens of smaller vessels separate from the harvester's bulk. They're launching boarding parties. The hegemony's new strategy became clear as the boarding pods spread throughout the battle space. Unable to destroy the modules efficiently with weapons fire, they were attempting to capture them intact. Each pod contained a squad of armed raiders who would force their way aboard, eliminate the crew, and either destroy the module from within or capture it for interrogation. All modules, Marcus broadcast, enemy is deploying boarding parties. If your module is boarded, remember your emergency protocols. Do not let them take anyone alive. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but he'd seen what the hegemony did to prisoners. A quick death was infinitely preferable to what would follow capture. Module 22 reported boarding contact first. Coordination 7. This is Module 22. Enemy pod has attached to our hull. They're cutting through, the transmission cut off in static and screaming. On Marcus's tactical display, Module 22's icon changed from green to amber to red in the span of 30 seconds. Module 22 is lost, Dr. Foster reported quietly. More boarding contacts followed. Modules 37, 41, and 6 all went silent as hegemony raiders overwhelmed their improvised defenses. Each loss meant hundreds of beings who had chosen to fight rather than surrender, beings who had trusted human coordination to give them a chance at survival. "We can't keep this up," Chief Engineer Thralvin observed grimly. "They're adapting to our evasion patterns, and we're losing modules faster than we can replace them." Marcus studied the tactical display, counting losses against time remaining. 45 modules left. 25 hours until rescue. The mathematics were stark. At the current attrition rate, they'd all be dead long before help arrived. Time to change the game, he decided. Coordination 7 to all modules. Marcus broadcast. "New orders. We're done being victims." "What are you thinking?" Tom's voice came back immediately. Marcus smiled grimly, the same expression that had marked the beginning of this entire chain of events. "I'm thinking that the hegemony's boarding parties are making a very dangerous assumption, which is that the modules they're boarding contain helpless civilians who will surrender when faced with armed opposition." Dr. Foster looked up from her controls, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. "You want to turn the boarding actions against them. The hegemony thinks they know how humans behave under pressure," Marcus continued, activating emergency protocols throughout their module. "They think we'll panic, surrender, beg for mercy. They have no idea what happens when humans stop trying to survive and start trying to win." The next boarding pod locked onto Module 7's hull 12 minutes later. Marcus felt the vibration as cutting tools began working through the outer airlock, followed by the distinctive sound of armed beings forcing their way through improvised barriers. "Positions," Marcus ordered quietly. His crew moved with practiced efficiency to predetermined locations throughout the module. Velthari technicians who had never held weapons before took cover behind equipment banks. Korth engineers positioned themselves near critical systems. Human civilians prepared to defend beings they'd met less than 24 hours earlier. The inner airlock exploded inward as the boarding party breached their final barrier. 6 hegemony raiders in powered armor stormed into the module's main compartment, weapons raised and targeting systems active. They were expecting terrified civilians. Instead, they found something the galaxy had somehow forgotten despite centuries of evidence. Humans who had committed themselves to protecting others and who would not be deterred by superior firepower, better armor, or overwhelming odds. The firefight lasted 47 seconds. When it ended, all 6 raiders were dead, and Module 7 was still under human control. "Module 7 to all units," Marcus broadcast, his voice carrying a note of fierce satisfaction. "Boarding party has been neutralized. Repeat, boarding can be survivable if you refuse to behave like victims." The Hegemony War Commander's response was swift and predictable. Frustrated by his inability to destroy or capture the elusive modules, HFY began concentrating his entire fleet's firepower on smaller and smaller areas of space, attempting to create kill zones that nothing could survive. It was a tactically sound decision that played directly into Marcus's hands. "All modules," he broadcast as energy weapons turned cubic kilometers of vacuum into lethal radiation. "Enemy is committing to area saturation tactics. Execute convergence pattern on my mark." What happened next violated every principle of military logic Marcus had ever learned. Instead of scattering to avoid the hegemony's concentrated firepower, the surviving modules began moving toward each other, forming up into a loose formation that made them easier targets. "Coordination 7, Sarah's voice crackled with static. "Are you sure about this?" "Trust me," Marcus replied, watching his tactical display as enemy fire began focusing on their new formation. Sometimes the only way to win is to give your enemy exactly what they think they want. The hegemony fleet concentrated their fire with devastating efficiency, pouring energy weapons into the space where the modules were converging. It should have been a massacre. 41 modules caught in a kill zone with no possibility of escape. Instead, at the precise moment when the enemy's weapons reached maximum intensity, Marcus gave the order that would define humanity's reputation in the galaxy for generations to come. "All modules, execute dispersal pattern Omega. Show them what happens when humans stop being afraid." 41 modules exploded outward from the convergence point in completely random directions, their emergency thrusters pushed beyond.